The snow started falling at noon, and by nightfall it had buried the world. Maggie Dunlap pulled her daughter closer against her chest and kept walking. The girl was 5 years old, burning with fever, wrapped in every blanket Maggie owned, which was 2. One was a quilt her mother had stitched in Missouri before the war. The other was a horse blanket she had taken from the barn of the last farm that had turned them away. 3 farms in 2 days. 3 doors closed against the cold. 3 families who had looked at her through the crack in their doors and decided that compassion was a luxury they could not afford. 3 women who had looked at Maggie's bare feet and her daughter's flushed face and said they were sorry, truly sorry. But times were hard, and they could not take in strangers. One of them had given her a jar of broth. Another had pointed up the mountain and said there was a trapper's cabin at the head of the creek, maybe 5 miles, but that the man who lived there did not welcome visitors. 5 miles uphill, in this snow, with a fevered child in her arms, barefoot because she had traded her only pair of boots 3 days ago for a sack of cornmeal that was already long gone. She walked. The trail climbed through stands of dark pine where the branches held the snow like cupped hands, and the world went quiet, except for the crunch of her feet and the rasp of Pearl's breathing against her neck. The girl had stopped crying an hour ago, which frightened Maggie more than the crying had. A child who cried was a child who still had the strength to fight. A child who went silent was a child who was giving up. "Stay with me," Maggie whispered into her daughter's hair. "Stay with me, Pearl. We are almost there." She did not know if that was true. She did not know where there was. She only knew that stopping meant dying, and she had not carried this girl 5 years through grief and poverty, and 3 closed doors to let the snow take her now. The snow came to her ankles, then her shins. She did not stop. She had stopped once, 2 years ago, when her husband Daniel was killed by a falling tree on the logging claim they had worked together. She had stopped then, stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped caring about anything except the small, warm body of the daughter who needed her. It had taken her 3 weeks to start moving again, and she had promised herself she would never stop a second time. The cabin appeared through the snow like something from a dream, low, dark, smoke threading from a stone chimney. A woodpile stacked 6 feet high against the north wall. A rough-hewn sled propped by the door. Light, faint, amber, the most beautiful color Maggie had ever seen, glowing behind a single shuttered window. She climbed the 3 steps to the door. Her feet were numb. She could not feel them. She held her daughter with one arm and knocked with the other, and the knocking was weak because her hands had stopped working properly. The door opened. The man who filled the frame was enormous, not fat, built, broad across the shoulders, thick through the arms, with hands the size of dinner plates and a beard that covered most of his face. He wore a wool shirt and leather breeches, and his feet were in moccasins. His eyes were dark and sharp, and they moved from Maggie's face to the child in her arms, to her bare feet in the snow, in the space of a single breath. "Both of you," he said, "inside. Now." His name was Boone Calloway, and he moved through his cabin with the efficiency of a man who had lived alone for a long time and knew exactly where everything was. He had the child out of Maggie's arms and onto a pallet of furs by the fire before she could protest. He wrapped the girl in a bearskin that smelled of wood smoke and pine pitch. He put a kettle on the hook and pulled a jar of dried yarrow from a shelf above the stove. "How long has she been fevered?" he asked. His voice was deep, direct, the kind of voice that expected answers and did not waste time on pleasantries. 2 days. It started in her chest and moved to her head. She was coughing blood this morning. Boone looked at the child. He put one enormous hand on her forehead, gentle as a man touching something made of glass, and his jaw tightened. "Croup gone bad," he said. "I have seen it. The yarrow will help. I have whiskey and honey for the cough. She needs to sweat through it. Are you a doctor? I am a man who has lived alone in the mountains for 9 years. You learn to doctor yourself or you die." He looked at her feet. "Sit down." She sat. He knelt in front of her and took her left foot in his hands, and the warmth of his palms against her frozen skin was so sudden and so sharp that she gasped. He examined both feet with the practiced care of someone who had seen frostbite before. "You caught it in time," he said. "Another hour and you would have lost the toes. I am going to wrap them. It will hurt when the feeling comes back." "I know. You have done this before?" "I walked barefoot through worse to bury my husband. Pain does not surprise me anymore." He looked up at her. Something shifted in his dark eyes. Not pity. She would have rejected pity, but a recognition. The look of a man who understood what it meant to keep walking when everything in you wanted to stop. He wrapped her feet in strips of soft deerskin. He made yarrow tea and held the cup to her daughter's lips, patient and unhurried, tilting it with a steadiness that contradicted the size of his hands. The girl, her name was Pearl, drank and coughed and drank again, and after an hour, her breathing eased and the flush on her cheeks began to fade from scarlet to pink. Maggie sat by the fire and watched this enormous, silent man tend her child with the tenderness of someone who had practice at it, and she wondered who he had been before he came to this mountain. "You had children," she said. It was not a question. His hands went still on the cup. "A son and a wife. Cholera took them both in the same week, 7 years ago. I am sorry. So am I." He set the cup down. Every day, Pearl slept. Her breathing steadied through the night, each exhale a little easier than the last. Boone stayed up through the small hours, feeding the fire, checking the child, adding yarrow to the steam kettle so the cabin filled with warm medicinal air. Maggie watched him through half-closed eyes, this mountain of a man moving through his cabin like a shadow, quiet for all his size, checking the girl with a touch so light it barely dimmed the firelight on her face. Sometime past midnight, he sat down in the chair by the stove and pulled a deerskin across his knees, and she heard the slow rasp of his breathing settle into the rhythm of a man who slept like a soldier, light, watchful, ready to wake at the smallest sound. She understood then that he had done this before. He had sat up through the night with a sick child. He had fed the fire and checked the forehead and measured each breath. And he had lost. The weight of that knowledge settled on her chest like a stone, and she let herself sleep because she knew, for the first time in 2 years, that someone else was keeping watch. Maggie tried to stay awake, but the warmth of the fire. "What is it?" Pearl asked. Her voice was hoarse, but her eyes were clear. "A bear," Boone said. He held it up. It was rough, but recognizable. 4 legs, a round head, 2 small ears. "Does it have a name?" "Not yet, that is your job." Pearl studied the bear with the gravity of a 5-year-old making the most important decision of her life. "Mountain," she said. "Mountain," Boone repeated. He handed her the bear, and when her small fingers closed around it, something in his face changed. The hard line of his jaw softened. His dark eyes, which had been flat and careful since the moment he opened his door, went deep. Maggie saw it. She looked away because it was not hers to see. That private, devastated tenderness of a man remembering what it felt like to have a child reach for something he had made. The storm held for 3 days. Boone fed them from a larder that was better stocked than any she had seen. Smoked venison, dried berries, cornmeal, honey, a barrel of potatoes he had dug before the frost. He melted snow for water and kept the fire built high. He made Pearl a second animal, a horse, this time, and then a third, a rabbit, and by the second evening the pallet by the fire held a small wooden menagerie, a bear, a horse, a rabbit, a deer with antlers no thicker than matchsticks, that Pearl arranged and rearranged with the fierce concentration of a child, building a world she could finally trust not to disappear. On the second evening, Boone brought out a checkerboard carved from 2 colors of wood, dark walnut and pale birch, and taught Pearl to play. The girl lost 7 games in a row and demanded an 8th, and Boone played with the patient seriousness of a man who understood that losing gracefully was a skill worth teaching. Maggie watched from the rocking chair he had pulled close to the fire for her, mending a tear in Pearl's dress with thread Boone had produced from a tin box on the top shelf, and the domesticity of the scene struck her with such force that she had to put the needle down and press her hands flat against her knees. He gave Maggie a pair of moccasins lined with rabbit fur. "You do not have to cry," he said, standing in the kitchen with his back to her. his voice rough. "I am not crying because I am sad," she said. "I am crying because you are kind." And I had forgotten what that felt like. He did not turn around. He stood there with his hands on the edge of the counter and his shoulders bowed, and she understood that her words had landed somewhere he kept locked. On the fourth morning the storm broke. Maggie woke to silence, the absence of wind, the absence of snow hissing against the shutters, and for a moment she did not know where she was. Then she felt the warmth of the fire and the weight of the bearskin, and heard Pearl breathing beside her, steady and clear, and the relief hit her so hard she had to press both hands against her face and breathe through it. The sun came through the trees like something holy. She had no money. She had no boots. She had a 5-year-old daughter who had just recovered from croup, and a wooden bear named Mountain, and nothing else. Boone came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without a word and stood beside her, not touching, not speaking. Steam rose from the cups into the cold, bright air. "I was a teacher," Maggie said, "before Daniel." "I know. Pearl told me. She said you taught her the alphabet using sticks in the dirt." Maggie almost smiled. "She talks to you more than she talks to most people. Children talk to people who listen." She looked at him. He looked at the mountains. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had both lost everything and were standing on the edge of something they were afraid to name. "I could take you to Elkhorn," he said, "on the sled. The trail is passable if we leave before noon." "And then what?" "And then you teach, and I come back here. Alone. I have been alone for 9 years. I am used to it. Being used to something is not the same as wanting it." He turned his head and looked at her. The sun was behind her, and it lit the edges of her hair, and she saw his eyes move across her face, not with desire, not with calculation, but with the slow, helpless recognition of a man who had just realized that the door he had closed 7 years ago was standing open. "No," he said. "It is not." Pearl came out onto the porch holding Mountain the bear. She looked at Boone, then at her mother, then at the mountains glowing white in the morning sun. "I do not want to go to Elkhorn," she said. "Pearl," Maggie began. "I want to stay here with the bears." She looked up at Boone. "Can we stay?" Boone Calloway looked at the child he had whittled bears for, at the woman he had carried to warmth, at the moccasins on her feet that had belonged to a wife he still mourned every day. He looked at the mountain that had been his whole world for 9 years, and at the 2 people who had walked through a blizzard and knocked on his door and cracked it open. "You can stay," he said. His voice broke on the second word. He cleared his throat and tried again. "You can stay as long as you like, both of you, for as long as you want." Maggie reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, enormous, calloused, warm. And he held on the way. A man holds on to something he thought he would never have again. "We would like to stay a long time," she said. "Good," he said. "I will make more bears." Pearl laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in weeks, bright and sudden in the cold morning air, and the sound of it echoed off the mountain and came back to them like a promise. They stayed, not because they had nowhere else to go. Elkhorn had a school, and Maggie had the skills to run it, but because the mountain had become something more than shelter. It had become the place where Pearl learned to name the birds, where Maggie learned to split kindling without flinching, where Boone learned that silence was not the same thing as peace, and that a cabin with laughter in it was warmer than one with only fire. They stayed through the spring thaw. The preacher from Elkhorn came up the mountain in October. He found a cabin with curtains in the windows, a garden plot cleared for spring, a child's laughter ringing in the yard, and a man and a woman sitting on the porch in the evening light, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm around her, both of them looking at the mountains as if they had finally stopped being a wall and had become a home. The ceremony was short, and the mountain was the only witness besides Pearl and the preacher. He married them on the porch, with Pearl standing between them. That night, Maggie set 3 places at the table for supper. She had been setting 2 for so long that the 3rd plate felt like a declaration. Boone looked at it, and then at her, and then at Pearl. who was feeding imaginary porridge to a wooden bear, and his dark eyes filled with something he did not try to blink away. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For knocking." She smiled. "Thank you for opening."